Did you know that the story you learned in school, the one with the 3 little ships and the determined Italian explorer, is just one chapter in a book that's thousands of pages long? You picture him, Christopher Columbus, standing heroically on the deck, wind in his magnificent hair, or whatever that bowl-cut situation was in his portraits, pointing toward a new world. It's a simple, satisfying story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it fits neatly on a test. But like most things that fit neatly on a test, it's not the whole truth. It's not even close. Before you get too comfortable, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel to encourage me to make more content like this. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's journey. You are standing on a beach. The sand is warm and white, a fine powder between your toes. The water is a shade of blue, so clear it feels like a dream, and the air is thick with the sweet scent of flowers and salt. It is October 12, 1492. Out on the horizon, you see them, 3 wooden ships, larger and stranger than any canoe you have ever seen, with vast white sails that billow like clouds snared from the sky. Men are rowing to shore in smaller boats. They look pale, their faces are covered in hair, and they are wrapped in layers of heavy, dark cloth, which seems incredibly impractical for the tropical heat. Their leader steps onto the sand, plants a flag, and claims this land for a king and queen you have never heard of, in a world you do not know exists. He believes he has reached the East Indies. He is, of course, spectacularly wrong. This man, Cristoforo Colombo, has become the central character in a grand epic of discovery. The story is a famous one. He was an ambitious navigator, convinced he could reach the lucrative spice markets of Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. After years of rejection, he finally secured the patronage of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain. They gave him 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and a crew of about 90 men. After a long and tense voyage, they spotted land. This moment is often painted as the grand opening of the Americas to the world. But was it a discovery, or was it more of an arrival? Can you truly discover a place that is already home to millions of people, with thriving cities, complex societies, and histories stretching back for millennia? It's a bit like claiming you discovered a house because you were the first person on your street to walk through the unlocked front door. The story of who really discovered America is not a single, straight line. It is a vast, tangled web of voyages, migrations, and accidental landfalls. It is a story of many beginnings, not one. And even the most famous part of this story, Columbus's landing, is wrapped in its own little mysteries. For centuries, people have accepted that the island he first named San Salvador is the one now known as San Salvador in the Bahamas. Yet, this is far from a settled fact. Historians still debate the precise location of Guanahani, the island Columbus first landed on, with several candidates in the Bahamas fiercely defended by their proponents. Some argue for Samana Cay, others for Plana Cays, each using Columbus's own logs to chart a different course. The very first step of the most famous journey in this story is a footprint that could be in a half-dozen different places. To find the real beginning, we have to travel much, much further back in time. We need to go to a world of ice. Forget the warm sand and the turquoise water. Let the image of Columbus's ships fade from your mind like a watercolor painting left in the rain. We are going somewhere else entirely, somewhere much, much older. The air here is not thick with the scent of flowers. It is thin, and it bites at your skin with a dry, persistent chill. You are standing on a vast, windswept plain, under a sky that seems impossibly large and pale. There are no trees here, only hardy shrubs, mosses, and grasses that crunch under your feet like frozen straw. This is not an island. It is not even a continent as you know it. This is a lost world. You are in Bering, the land bridge that once connected Asia and North America. and the year is roughly 20,000 BC. This wasn't a narrow, icy bridge like something from a fantasy novel. It was an immense subcontinent, more than 1,000 miles wide, a sprawling expanse of cold, dry steppe that was exposed when massive glaciers locked up much of the world's water, causing sea levels to plummet. You look around, and you are not alone. A small family group, wrapped in expertly stitched furs and hides, is moving slowly but purposefully across the landscape. They are following the tracks of giants. This is the world of the Pleistocene megafauna. Herds of woolly mammoths, their shaggy coats swaying in the ceaseless wind, graze in the distance. Fierce saber-toothed cats and giant short-faced bears are the apex predators here. And these human families are a part of this brutal, beautiful ecosystem. They are not explorers seeking glory or gold. They are hunters, survivors, families moving with the rhythm of the seasons and the migration of the animals that provide their food, their clothing, and their tools. For a long time, the story was simple. People chased mammoths across the bridge and, once they were in the New World, spread out like wildfire. But recent genetic evidence has painted a far more intricate and human picture. This leads to a fascinating and obscure idea known to archaeologists as the Bering Standstill. It suggests that the ancestors of the first Americans didn't just rush across this land bridge. They stopped. They lived here, in this seemingly inhospitable world, for thousands of years. They were genetically isolated from their ancestral populations in Siberia, adapting and developing the unique genetic markers that would later be found throughout the Americas. For generations upon generations, this frozen plain was not a hallway, it was a home. Imagine the stories they told, the skills they perfected, the culture they built in a world that no longer exists. This long pause is a crucial part of the story, a testament to human adaptability. These were not primitive people wandering aimlessly. They were masters of their environment. They understood the subtle shifts in the wind, the patterns of the stars in the clear, cold sky, and the behavior of the massive beasts they hunted with, spears tipped with meticulously crafted stone points. Eventually, the climate began to change. The colossal ice sheets that had covered most of North America, the Laurentide to the east and the Corduron in the west, began to retreat. A corridor, a path between the ice, began to open up. Historians and archaeologists still debate the exact timing and the number of migration waves, but the path was there. After millennia of living in this Ice Age refuge, the journey south began. These people, the true pioneers, stepped out of Bering and into a truly new world, an empty continent teeming with life, ready to be discovered from within. You are now thousands of years forward in time. The ice-free corridor has widened, and the great glaciers have shrunken into memory, leaving behind a new world carved with lakes and rivers. The descendants of the Beringen travelers have spread across the continent, adapting with incredible speed. You find yourself on a grassy plain in what will one day be New Mexico. The air is warmer, the sun brighter, and everywhere you look, there are ghosts. Not the spectral kind that haunt old houses, but the ghosts of a people left behind in stone. For decades, these were the oldest ghosts that archaeologists could find, the very first definitive proof of a widespread human culture in the Americas. This culture is known as Clovis. They are named after the town of Clovis, New Mexico, where their distinctive tools were first discovered in the 1920s, found directly alongside the bones of extinct megafauna. This was the smoking gun. It proved that humans were in the Americas during the Ice Age, hunting the massive beasts of legend. The calling card of the Clovis people, their undeniable signature, is a masterpiece of Stone Age technology, the Clovis point. You pick one up. It's cool and heavy in your hand, fashioned from a beautiful piece of flint or chert. It's larger than a modern arrowhead, about the length of your palm, and it is lethally sharp. But its most defining feature is something you have to look closely to see. A channel, or flute, has been expertly chipped away from the base on both sides. This wasn't for decoration. It was a brilliant innovation, allowing the point to be hafted securely onto a wooden spear shaft. It was, in its way, the high-tech, modular weaponry of its day. Finding a Clovis point is like finding a specific brand name stamped across the ancient landscape. For a long time, the prevailing theory, known as Clovis First, stated that these people were the first humans to enter and settle the Americas around 13,500 years ago. They were seen as super predators who swept down the continent, their deadly spears driving the mammoths and mastodons to extinction in a geological blink of an eye. The story was clean, dramatic, and fit the evidence. But the truth, as it so often does, turned out to be much messier. One of the most curious and often overlooked facts about these people is their incredible knowledge of geology. Clovis points found at a kill site are often made from high-quality stone quarried from hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of miles away. This suggests they either traveled vast distances, maintaining a mental map of an entire subcontinent's resources, or participated in long-distance trade networks we can barely comprehend. This is where our simple story begins to unravel. For years, any archaeological claim of a human presence before Clovis was met with extreme skepticism. It was an archaeological dogma. Then, evidence began to mount that couldn't be ignored. Sites like Monte Verde in southern Chile, preserved in a peat bog, yielded artifacts, wooden structures, and even a child's footprint dated to at least 14,500 years ago. A full millennium before the Clovis people appeared in the record. The existence of these sites threw a wrench into the tidy Clovis First narrative. Archaeologists now fiercely debate the timing and routes of the first migrations, with many now believing in a much earlier coastal migration by people who used boats to hopscotch down the Pacific coast. The Clovis people were not the first. They were just the first ones to leave behind a trail of brand-name breadcrumbs, so obvious that we couldn't miss it. The land was already ancient, already home, long before their ghostly spears ever flew. The ghostly trail of Clovis points fades into the soil, and the landscape around you transforms. The sparse Ice Age steppe is replaced by a dense, suffocatingly green jungle. The air is no longer cold and dry, but heavy with moisture, thick with the scent of damp earth, night-blooming jasmine, and the smoky perfume of copal incense. You are standing in the heart of a city, a metropolis of limestone and stucco that rises from the tangled green like a white stone dream. This is the world of the Maya, around the year 800 AD, centuries before Columbus would even be born. Before you, a massive pyramid, its sides a steep staircase to the heavens, pierces the jungle canopy. At its base is a sprawling plaza, paved with plaster and teeming with thousands of people. You watch them. Merchants haggle over cacao beans, which they use as currency, their voices a lively hum. Artisans display brilliantly colored pottery and textiles woven with intricate geometric patterns. Priests in elaborate headdresses adorned with the iridescent green feathers of the quetzal bird move with solemn purpose toward the temples. The faces of the people are a living library of their culture. You notice something extraordinary about their smiles. Many of the elite have their teeth filed into points or other shapes, and some even have small polished discs of jade or obsidian inlaid directly into their front teeth. This wasn't a sign of poor dental hygiene, quite the opposite. This was high fashion, a status symbol, a form of permanent, glittering body art that must have been excruciatingly painful to achieve. It was a commitment to beauty and social standing that is both alien and deeply human. This is not a primitive society. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient world, a complex dance of phonetic symbols and logograms that they carved onto stone monuments, known as stelae, and painted into books made of bark paper. They were brilliant mathematicians who independently developed the concept of zero, a revolutionary idea that allowed them to make incredibly complex calculations. This mathematical prowess was tied directly to their other great passion, astronomy. They tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets with breathtaking accuracy. They created multiple, interlocking calendars, including a 365-day solar calendar, more precise than the one being used in Europe at the time. Their entire world, from the planting of maize to the coronation of kings, was governed by the sacred rhythms of the cosmos. Now, let your mind drift north, far away from the Mesoamerican jungle, across the Gulf of Mexico, and up the winding, muddy artery of the Mississippi River. Here, near modern-day St. Louis, another city thrives. There are no stone pyramids here. Instead, you see something even more staggering in its scale. The city of Cahokia is a landscape of massive earthen mounds, built by hand, basketful by basketful, over generations. The largest, now called Monk's Mound, is a fortress behemoth that stands 10 stories tall and covers more area at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. At its peak, in the 12th century, Cahokia was a sprawling urban center, home to as many as 20,000 people, making it larger than London was at the time. This was the center of a vast trade network that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. These were not scattered, isolated tribes. This was a continent of interconnected nations, of empires that rose and fell, of cities that were built and, eventually, abandoned. Archaeologists and historians still debate the precise reasons for their decline, pointing to a complex web of factors like climate change, internal warfare, or resource depletion. The point is, this land was not an empty wilderness. It was a landscape of memory, filled with stories, ruins, and the legacies of civilizations that had already lived their entire lifespan before a single European sail appeared on the horizon. Let the image of the great earthen mounds of Cahokia dissolve into the river mist. We are traveling not just north, but across an ocean and back in time, to the jagged fjord-carved coast of Norway around the year 958. The air here is sharp and clean, smelling of pine and cold, salt water. The sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows from mountains that plunge directly into the dark, deep water. This is the homeland of the Norsemen, a people you probably know by another name, the Vikings. But forget the cartoonish images of horned helmets, a flourish that historians have found no evidence for. The reality is far more practical and far more impressive. You are standing on a wooden dock, the rough-hewn planks slick with sea spray. Moored before you is the key to their world, the vessel that made them the masters of the North Atlantic, the Longship. It is a work of terrifying beauty. It is long, narrow, and shallow, with a flexible hull built in the clinker style, where the planks overlap like scales. This design allows it to ride the waves rather than crash through them, making it both incredibly fast and seaworthy. It can navigate the open ocean and then, because of its shallow draft, sail miles up a shallow river to trade or raid. At the front, a fearsome dragon's head, carved from wood and painted in bright colors, rears up, its mouth open in a silent roar. It's pure psychological warfare, designed to strike fear into the hearts of those who saw it approaching their shores. These ships, powered by a single large, square sail and supplemented by the rhythmic pull of dozens of oars, are the engines of an incredible expansion. For centuries, the Norse have been pushing out from their Scandinavian homeland. Historians still debate whether this explosive expansion was driven by a lust for silver, a desperate need for new farmland, or simply a cultural glorification of the bold adventurer who risked everything for fame and fortune. Whatever the cause, they have become a force of nature. They have settled in the British Isles, in France, and have sailed their dragon ships all the way to Constantinople. But their most audacious journeys have been to the west, into the vast, empty, and intimidating expanse of the open Atlantic. They island hopped, first to the Shetland and Faroe Islands, and then, in the late 9th century, they crossed a huge stretch of open water to colonize Iceland, a rugged land of volcanoes and glaciers. For 100 years, Iceland was the western edge of their known world, until a man named Erik Thorvaldsen, better known as Erik the Red, enters our story. You see him now, a broad-shouldered man with a temper as fiery as his famous red beard. He is a product of a harsh and violent society. In Iceland, he gets into a dispute with his neighbors over some loaned property. The dispute escalates, as they often did, and ends with Erik killing 2 men. The punishment, according to Norse law, is not prison. It is exile. He is banished from Iceland for 3 years. For a man like Erik, this is not an end, but an opportunity. He has heard stories, whispers of a vast land even further to the west, sighted decades earlier by a sailor named Gunnbjörn who had been blown off course. So Erik gathers his family and loyal followers, provisions a ship, and sails not into a known harbor, but into the unknown. After a perilous journey across the ice-choked Denmark Strait, he finds it. A massive island, the largest in the world, a place of towering glaciers and deep, sheltered fjords. He spends his 3 years of exile exploring the coastline, finding areas in the south where the land is surprisingly green and fertile in the short summer months. When his exile is over, he sails back to Iceland with a plan. He needs to convince people to follow him back to this new land. And here, Erik the Red proves he is not just a killer and an explorer, but perhaps the world's first and most successful, if slightly dishonest, real estate developer. He names the vast, ice-covered island Greenland, reasoning that people would be more tempted to go there if it had an attractive name. It works. In 985 AD, he leads a fleet of 25 ships filled with hundreds of settlers back to establish a permanent Norse colony. They have taken one more giant leap into the west. They are now perched on the very edge of North America, and they don't even know it's there. The Greenland colony clings to life on the rocky fringes of a great ice cap. You are in a longhouse at Brattahley, Erik the Red's estate. The air is thick with smoke from a central fire pit, mingling with the smells of drying fish, damp wool, and people living in close quarters. It is a life of hardship, a constant battle against the cold and the scarcity of resources. Timber is so rare it has to be scavenged as driftwood or imported at great expense from Norway. Iron is a precious commodity. For all of Erik's marketing genius, Greenland is no paradise. But the Norse are survivors, and here, a new generation is coming of age, born on this remote outpost, with the same restless spirit as their parents. Among them is Leif Erikson, son of the famous Erik the Red. He is a young man with a heavy legacy to bear and a powerful ambition to make his own name. He has heard the stories, as everyone in the small colony has. Years earlier, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, sailing from Iceland to Greenland to join his father, was caught in a storm. He was blown far off course, lost in a sea of fog. When the fog finally lifted, he saw land to the west. It was not the familiar glacier-topped coast of Greenland. It was a land of low hills covered in trees. He saw it 3 times as he sailed north to get his bearings, but he never went ashore. He was a trader, not an explorer, and he was anxious to find his family. When he finally reached Greenland, his story was met with both interest and scorn. People criticized him for his lack of curiosity. "Why didn't you land?" they asked. "What did you see?" Leif Erikson is not a man to let such an opportunity pass. He is captivated by Bjarni's tale. He seeks out the old sailor, questions him about every detail, and in a move that shows his serious intent, he buys the very ship that Bjarni had used on that fateful voyage. He gathers a crew of 35 men and announces his plan. He will retrace Bjarni's route in reverse, and this time he will land. He will walk on that unknown shore. You are on the ship with him, feeling the familiar pitch and roll of the longship as it cuts through the frigid grey waters of the North Atlantic. After several days at sea, you sight land. The first place you come ashore is a desolate landscape of flat, grey stones and glaciers. There is no grass, nothing of value. Leif, practical and direct, names it Helgeland, the land of flat stones. This is likely modern Baffin Island. You sail south. The next land you find is flat and wooded, with long white beaches. Leif names this Markland, the land of forests, probably the coast of Labrador. The timber alone makes it a land of immense value to the Greenlanders. But Leif pushes on, sensing there is something better further south. Finally, you sail into a sheltered cove. The land that greets you is unlike anything you have seen. The climate is mild. The rivers teem with salmon larger than any you have ever caught in Greenland. The forests are thick with hardwood trees, perfect for building. You and the crew decide to stay for the winter, building temporary shelters. A small settlement Leif calls Leifsbeer or Leif's Booths. One day, a man named Turka, a German who had been Leif's foster father, goes missing. After a frantic search, he is found, babbling excitedly in German, his eyes wide. He has found something astonishing. He points to vines, thick with fruit, grapes. According to the Saga of the Greenlanders, he recognized them from his youth in a wine-producing region. The crew makes wine from them, and Leif, seeing the incredible abundance of this new place, names it Vinland, the land of wine. Historians still debate whether Vin truly referred to grapes, which grow only at the very northernmost edge of this region, or if it was an Old Norse word for pasture or meadowland. But whatever the name's origin, the message was clear. They had found an accidental paradise. For centuries, the story of Leif Erikson and Vinland was just that, a story. It was preserved in two Icelandic manuscripts, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. These were epic tales, filled with adventure, family feuds, and heroic deeds. But to most historians, they were folklore, not history. They were seen as fantastical accounts, the Norse equivalent of King Arthur and his knights. A land of wild grapes and giant salmon, discovered by accident. It was just a good yarn to tell by the fire during the long, dark Arctic winters, right? There was no proof, no map, no ruin. The story faded into the mists of myth, a footnote in the grand narrative of exploration. Then, you fast forward nearly 1,000 years. The year is 1960. You are no longer on Leif's ship. You are standing on a windswept coastal meadow at the very northern tip of Newfoundland, in Canada. The place is called Lonso Meadows, the Cove of the Jellyfish. It's a quiet, beautiful, and profoundly lonely place. A Norwegian husband and wife team, the explorer Helge Ingstad and the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, are here. They have spent years poring over the Old Norse sagas, convinced that the descriptions of Vinland were not fantasy, but garbled directions. They have been searching the coastline, asking locals about any strange old ruins. Here, a fisherman leads them to a series of low, grassy humps near the cove, which locals had always assumed were an old indigenous camp. As Anstein Ingstad and her team begin to excavate, the story of Vinland shifts from legend to fact. You are there with them, carefully scraping away layers of peat and soil. Underneath the sod, the outlines of buildings emerge. These are not the round wigwams or longhouses of the local First Nations peoples. They are distinctly Norse. You uncover the remains of 3 large longhouses, complete with central fire pits and raised wooden platforms for sleeping. Just like the ones in Greenland and Iceland, you find a forge, a small smithy where a blacksmith worked iron. The floor is still littered with iron slag, a byproduct of the smithing process, and hundreds of small, rusted iron rivets, identical to those used in building a longship. This was a boat repair shop, 1,000 years old and 5,000 miles from home. The small, personal items are what truly bring the ghostly settlement to life. You uncover a bone knitting needle and a spindle whorl, a small, weighted stone disc used for spinning yarn. The spindle whorl is one of the most significant finds. Spinning was women's work in Norse society, and its presence is near certain evidence that this was not just a temporary camp of male explorers, but a settlement that included women and families. An attempt to build a new life. Perhaps the most elegant artifact is a small, bronze, ring-headed pin, a common cloak fastener in the Viking world. It's a piece of jewelry, a personal belonging, dropped in the mud a millennium ago. But the most curious clue they found was botanical. Amidst the Norse ruins, archaeologists found butternuts and butternut tree wood. The thing is, butternuts, a type of walnut, do not grow in Newfoundland. Their natural habitat is hundreds of miles further south, in the milder climates of the St. Lawrence River Valley and New Brunswick. This single, unassuming nut is a bombshell. It proves that Meadows was not the full extent of Vinland. It was a base camp, a gateway from which the Norse launched further exploratory voyages deep into the heart of the new continent, to the warmer lands that better matched the saga's description of a place where grapes could grow. Archaeologists still debate the primary function of this small outpost, whether it was a failed colony or a carefully planned resource-gathering station. But what is not up for debate is that this site, Meadows, is the physical, undeniable footprint of Leif Erikson's Vinland on the shores of North America. They were here. You were walking through the ghostly outlines of the longhouses at Meadows. The wind whistles through the tall grass, the only sound in a place that was once filled with the ring of a blacksmith's hammer and the murmur of Old Norse voices. The evidence is clear. They were here, but their presence was fleeting, a brief and brutal chapter that ended almost as soon as it began. Why? Why didn't this become the first permanent European settlement in the Americas? Why did this incredible saga fade away? The answer lies in two things. One written in blood, and the other in the vast, unforgiving distance of the sea. The first and most immediate problem was that they were not alone. The sagas are clear on this. Soon after their arrival, the Norse encountered the indigenous inhabitants of the land, people they called Skrylings, a somewhat derogatory term that likely meant wretches or screamers. The sagas described the first meetings as a mix of curiosity and confusion. The Skrylings, likely the ancestors of the Bearthok or Micmac peoples, arrived in fleets of skin-covered canoes. Initial attempts at trade were made, with the Norse offering red cloth and milk in exchange for valuable furs. But the relationship was fragile, built on a foundation of profound mutual ignorance. A famous account in the saga of Eric the Red tells of how a bull from the Norse camp got loose and began to bellow, terrifying the Skrylings, who fled and did not return for 3 weeks. When they did, they came back not to trade, but to fight. The Norse had iron weapons, swords, and axes that gave them a terrifying advantage in close combat. But the Skrylings had mastery of the terrain and, crucially, overwhelming numbers. The Norse were a tiny handful of people, thousands of miles from any hope of reinforcement. The sagas tell of skirmishes and battles, of Norsemen being killed by a hail of arrows. One of the most eccentric and brutal stories concerns Freydis Eric's daughter, Eric the Red's own illegitimate daughter. During one attack, the Norsemen began to retreat. Freydis, heavily pregnant at the time, furiously berated them for their cowardice. She then picked up a sword from a fallen comrade, and to intimidate the attackers, she slapped her bare breast with the flat of the blade, letting out a terrifying war cry. The sight of this apparently enraged pregnant woman so stunned the Skrylings that they fell back, allowing the Norse to escape. It's a shocking, vivid image of the desperation and violence that characterized their time in Vinland. This constant conflict was simply unsustainable. But even if relations had been peaceful, the Vinland settlement was doomed by its own geography. Historians still debate whether the primary cause of the settlement's failure was the fierce native resistance or the logistical nightmare of its extreme isolation from the Norse homelands. Meadows was the last, most distant link in a chain that was already stretched to its breaking point. It was a colony of a colony. To get supplies or people from Norway to Vinland required a series of perilous sea voyages, from Norway to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland's eastern settlement, from there to the western settlement, and finally, across the treacherous Davis Strait, It was the dead end on the world's longest and most dangerous supply chain. And so, after only a few years, they gave up. They packed their longships with timber, furs, and perhaps some of those butternuts, and they sailed back to the relative safety of Greenland. But the story didn't end there. It simply went silent. The knowledge of Vinland was never transmitted to the rest of Europe. It was a family story, a local legend preserved in handwritten sagas that were read only in the remote, sparsely populated world of Iceland. There was no printing press to spread the news. There was no king who saw a strategic or economic advantage in funding more voyages. The Viking Age was ending, and Scandinavia was turning its attention to the politics of mainland Europe. The memory of Vinland became a ghost story, a whisper on the northern wind, forgotten by the wider world until a husband and wife team followed its clues 1,000 years later. The Viking longships recede into the grey mists of the North Atlantic. Their story, for now, is over. But the ocean is vast, and it has more than one shore. Now, you stand on a different coast, under a different sky. The air is warm and humid, scented with salt and tropical flowers. The sun is a brilliant, hot disk in a deep blue sky. Before you, the Pacific Ocean stretches out, a seemingly infinite expanse of shimmering water. You are on an island in Polynesia, perhaps Easter Island, known to its inhabitants as Rapa Nui, around the year 1200 AD. The people here are the masters of this ocean. For centuries, they have been engaged in one of the most remarkable feats of exploration in human history. Using massive double-hulled canoes, sewn together with coconut fiber rope and powered by triangular sails woven from pandanus leaves, they have systematically explored and settled a triangle of the Pacific Ocean so vast it dwarfs the continent of Europe. They are not drifting aimlessly, they are navigating. They possess a breathtakingly sophisticated understanding of the natural world. You watch a navigator at work. He is a living computer, a human GPS. He lies on his back on the deck of the canoe to better feel the subtle patterns of the ocean swells as they refract around distant, unseen islands. He reads the stars, not just as fixed points, but as moving paths that rise and set at specific points on the horizon. He understands the migratory patterns of birds, the color of the water, the shapes of the clouds that tend to form over land. It is a science passed down through generations, an art of wayfinding that allowed them to cross thousands of miles of open ocean with pinpoint accuracy. Their expansion across the Pacific was a deliberate, multi-generational project that took them from Southeast Asia to the farthest corners of their world, from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the southwest, and to Rapa Nui in the southeast, the most isolated inhabited place on Earth. And it is, from this point, the southeastern edge of their world, that our next mystery begins. Did they keep going? Did their canoes, guided by the same skills and the same restless spirit, reach the shores of South America? For a long time, this idea was dismissed by mainstream academia, but the evidence, subtle yet persistent, has become impossible to ignore. The most compelling clue is a humble, lumpy vegetable. You are in a garden, not in Polynesia, but high in the Andes Mountains of Peru. A farmer is digging up sweet potatoes. The local Quechua word for this root vegetable is kumar. Now, travel back across 5,000 miles of ocean to Polynesia. The word for sweet potato there, from Hawaii to New Zealand to Rapa Nui, is kumara, or some variation thereof. The sweet potato is native to the Americas. It did not exist anywhere else in the world before Columbus. So how did it get to Polynesia centuries before any European arrived in the Pacific? The linguistic link is too strong to be a coincidence. It is powerful evidence that Polynesian sailors reached South America, acquired the sweet potato, and brought it back to spread throughout their island world. The evidence flows in the other direction as well. In 2007, archaeologists excavating a site at El Arenal in Chile found chicken bones. This was a startling discovery. Chickens are not native to the Americas. They were domesticated in Asia and brought to the Pacific Islands by the Polynesians. When the bones were radiocarbon dated, they were found to be from between 1321 and 1407 AD, a full century before Columbus's voyage and before the Spanish introduced their own chickens to the continent. Genetic testing confirmed that the DNA of these pre-Columbian Chilean chickens was an exact match for the chickens found on ancient Polynesian islands like Tonga and Samoa. Historians and geneticists still debate the validity and interpretation of this evidence, but it points to an incredible conclusion. A Polynesian canoe, a vessel of wood and rope, landed on the coast of Chile, and a trade, or at least a brief encounter, took place. It was a meeting of two of the world's greatest navigational traditions, two streams of human history that had been separate for tens of thousands of years. Briefly touching on a remote South American beach, the double-hulled canoes of Polynesia become small specks on the vast Pacific, their story a subtle but powerful current in our journey. Now, shift your perspective once more. You are no longer in a small, hand-built vessel. You are standing on the deck of a ship so colossal it beggars belief. You are in the port of Nanjing, China, in the early 15th century. The air is alive with the sounds of a bustling harbor, the shouts of sailors, the creak of bamboo scaffolding, and the rhythmic chant of thousands of laborers. Before you, bobbing gently at anchor on the Yangtze River, is a fleet that represents the greatest naval power the world has ever seen. This is the treasure fleet of the Ming dynasty. The ships themselves are technological marvels. The largest, the legendary Bochuan or treasure ships, are said to have been over 400 feet long and 150 feet wide. For comparison, Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, was a mere 85 feet long. It was a minnow next to this Leviathan. You could have parked it sideways on the deck of a treasure ship with room to spare. These were floating cities with 9 masts, watertight bulkheads, and the capacity to carry over 1,000 men, along with livestock, gardens for fresh vegetables, and vast quantities of cargo. They were commanded by one of the most remarkable figures in maritime history, a towering, charismatic court eunuch named Zheng He. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 epic expeditions into the Indian Ocean. This was not a voyage of discovery in the European sense. The Chinese knew what was there. This was a projection of power, a diplomatic and economic mission on an unprecedented scale. The Yongle Emperor wanted to display the glory and technological might of the Ming dynasty, establish tributary relationships, and control the lucrative trade routes. Zheng He's fleets sailed to Vietnam, to India, to the Persian Gulf, and all the way to the east coast of Africa, bringing back ambassadors, tribute, and exotic wonders. The most famous of these were the giraffes from Somalia, which the Chinese court believed were the mythical Qilin, a creature of good omen. Zheng He's voyages are a well-documented historical fact, but here our story sails off the edge of the map and into the realm of fascinating, though highly controversial, theory. In 2002, a retired British submarine commander named Gavin Menzies published a book called 1421, The Year China Discovered America. In it, he put forth a breathtaking hypothesis. He claimed that on the 6th expedition, which departed in 1421, a portion of Zheng He's fleet did not return to China but continued on, sailing around the southern tip of Africa, across the Atlantic to the Americas, around the tip of South America into the Pacific, and even reaching Australia, effectively circumnavigating the globe a century before Magellan. Menzies's evidence is a sprawling web of clues. He points to ancient Chinese maps that seem to show the Americas, to shipwreck sites with Chinese-style anchors, and to genetic markers in certain Native American populations that suggest a Chinese origin. One of the most curious pieces of evidence he presents involves nautical charts. He argues that many of the early European maps that suddenly appeared in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, showing lands that Europeans had not yet officially visited, were actually copies of earlier Chinese maps that had made their way to Europe through Venetian traders. The theory is epic, romantic, and would completely rewrite our understanding of world history. It's the stuff of a grand adventure novel. However, it is crucial to state that the 1421 hypothesis is almost universally rejected by professional historians and sinologists. They argue that Menzies misinterprets maps, that his archaeological evidence is flimsy or misidentified, and that there is absolutely no mention of such an epic voyage in the extensive official records of the Ming court. Historians still debate the full extent and purpose of Zhenghe's voyages, but the ideal of a global circumnavigation is considered pure speculation. The story is a powerful what if. What if this naval superpower had not suddenly turned inward? In 1433, a new emperor came to power, and China's great age of exploration came to an abrupt end. The great ships were left to rot, the records were destroyed, and China closed its doors to the outside world. It's a tantalizing glimpse of a completely different history, a world where the first ships on the American horizon might have flown not the flag of Spain, but the golden dragon of the Ming dynasty. The grand, dragon-proud ships of the Chinese treasure fleet dissolve like a mirage on the water. We leave the world of documented, if debated, history and venture into the softer, hazier realm of folklore and national myth. You find yourself not on the open sea, but in a windswept castle in the mountains of Wales. The year is 1170. The air is cool and damp, smelling of wood smoke and rain-soaked stone. You are listening to the songs of a bard, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of a harp, telling tales of heroes and kings. The story he tells is one that will be passed down for centuries, a whisper that becomes a legend. The story of Prince Madoc. According to the tale, Madoc ab Owain Gwynedd was one of the many sons of Owain Gwynedd, the powerful king of Gwynedd in North Wales. Upon the king's death, a bitter and bloody civil war erupted among his sons, all vying for the throne. Madoc, a man of peace and a skilled sailor, was disgusted by the fratricidal violence. He and his brother Rhiarad decided they wanted no part of it. They would seek a new life, a new kingdom, far away from the bloodshed of their homeland. They provisioned a small fleet of ships and sailed west from what is now Abergele, on the Welsh coast, heading out into the unknown Atlantic. The legend says that they sailed for weeks, finally reaching a new, fertile land. They found a place that was vast, beautiful, and peaceful, free from the endless strife of their old lives. Madoc left a small group of his followers to establish a colony, and then sailed back to Wales to gather more settlers. He is said to have assembled a second fleet of 10 ships, filled with men and women eager to escape the war, and sailed west once more, never to be seen or heard from again. It is a classic hero's tale, a story of a noble prince who chooses peace over war and founds a new utopia in a distant land. For centuries, it was just that, a beloved piece of Welsh folklore. Then, something strange happened. The story got a second life during the Elizabethan era. In the late 16th century, England was in a fierce rivalry with Spain for control of the New World. The Spanish had based their claims on the voyage of Columbus. England needed its own, earlier claim. The story of Prince Madoc was a perfect piece of political propaganda. Queen Elizabeth I's own advisors, like the famous scholar John Dee, who happened to be of Welsh descent, promoted the legend as historical fact. They argued that Madoc's voyage in 1170 gave England a prior claim to North America, predating Columbus by over 300 years. The story was printed in books and became a popular part of the national consciousness. The legend took on a life of its own, especially in America. People started to look for the Welsh Indians, the supposed descendants of Madoc's colonists, who had intermarried with Native American tribes. The most famous candidates were the Mandan people, who lived along the Missouri River. Observers in the 18th and 19th centuries claimed that the Mandan people were lighter skinned than their neighbors, that their villages were built in a European style, and that their language contained Welsh words. They were said to use bullboats, a type of coracle, which bore a striking resemblance to the traditional Welsh fishing boats of the same name. An eccentric Welshman named John Evans even explored the American frontier in the 1790s, with a commission from the Spanish, of all people, specifically to find these Welsh-speaking Indians and claim their territory for Spain. He spent years living with the Mandan and other tribes, and in the end, he concluded there was no trace of Welsh influence whatsoever. Historians still debate the origins of the Madoc myth, with most agreeing it is a romantic fabrication, perhaps conflating the tales of several different voyages. There is no archaeological evidence, no definitive linguistic link, and no mention of Madoc's voyage in any contemporary Welsh chronicles. Yet, the story persists. It is a powerful example of how a good story, especially one that serves a national purpose, can take root in the public imagination and blur the lines between history and myth. It speaks to a deep human desire to find our own ancestors, our own people, in the great story of the past. Let the green hills of Wales and the legend of Prince Madoc fade into the Celtic mist. We travel further back in time to a place of saints and scholars, of windswept monasteries and breathtaking faith. You are on the rocky western coast of Ireland in the 6th century. The world here feels ancient, elemental. The roar of the Atlantic is a constant companion, and the sky is a canvas of shifting grey clouds and brilliant, fleeting sunlight. This is the edge of the known world. To the west, there is nothing but the sea of darkness, an ocean of monsters and demons. To sail into it is to sail into the arms of oblivion. But you are in the company of a man who does not fear the unknown. His name is Brendan of Clonfert, a real historical figure, one of the early Irish monastic saints. He was a great church founder and a renowned sailor, earning him the nickname the Navigator or the Voyager. And it is his legendary voyage, recorded in a 9th century Latin text called the Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abitus, the Voyage of Saint Brendan the Abbot, that concerns us now. The text is not a ship's log or a historical chronicle. It is a hagiography, a story of a saint's life, and it reads like a fantastic adventure, a Christianized version of an Imram, a traditional Irish sequest tale. According to the Navigatio, an abbot named Berinthus visits Brendan and tells him of a paradise island he has visited in the far Atlantic, a place called the Promised Land of the Saints. Brendan, filled with holy fervor, decides he must see this paradise for himself. He and a group of fellow monks build a curragh, a traditional Irish boat. You look at this vessel. It is a remarkable piece of naval engineering. Its frame is made of light, flexible wood, like wicker, and it is covered not with planks, but with ox hides, stitched together and waterproofed with grease. It seems impossibly fragile, a leather basket to be tossed on the whims of the great ocean. Brendan and his monks set sail, and for 7 years they journey through a surreal and magical seascape. They land on an island of giant sheep. They are attacked by a sea monster that is then slain by another, friendlier sea monster. They celebrate Easter on the back of a giant whale they mistake for an island. A famous episode in medieval folklore known as the They encounter talking birds. They sail past a crystal pillar, and they are tormented by demons on a fiery, volcanic island. It is a journey straight out of a fantasy novel, a world of wonders and divine tests. Finally, after many trials, they pass through a thick wall of fog and arrive at the Promised Land. It is an island of unimaginable beauty and fertility, where the sun never sets and the trees are always laden with fruit. After exploring it for 40 days, they are told by an angel to return home, and they do, their faith confirmed. For centuries, the Navigatio was one of the most popular books in Europe, a medieval bestseller. But no one took it literally. It was an allegory, a story about the spiritual journey of the soul. Then, in the 1970s, a British explorer and historian named Tim Severin had a radical idea. What if the fantastical elements of the story were just medieval embellishments on a real voyage? What if the islands of sheep, the crystal pillars, and the fiery mountains were garbled descriptions of real places and natural phenomena encountered on a transatlantic journey? The island of sheep could be the Faroe Islands, with their large flocks. The crystal pillar could be an iceberg. The fiery mountain could be a volcano in Iceland. To test his theory, Severin did something extraordinary. He and his crew built an exact replica of Brendan's boat, a 36-foot two-masted curragh made of ash and oak, covered with 49 tanned ox hides and sealed with wool grease. In 1976, they set sail from Ireland, determined to prove that a leather boat could cross the Atlantic. The journey was a grueling, year-long ordeal, but they made it. They sailed via the Hebrides and the Faroes to Iceland. They overwintered there, and the next spring, they braved the ice floes of the Denmark Strait to reach Greenland, and finally, they landed in Newfoundland. Severin had proven that the voyage was possible. This, of course, does not prove that it happened. Historians still overwhelmingly view the Navigatio as a work of religious fiction, not a historical record. But the story of Saint Brendan, the navigator, endures, a testament to the incredible seafaring skills of the early Irish monks and a lingering question mark on the ancient map of the Atlantic. We leave the misty shores of medieval Ireland and the echo of a saint's prayer. Our journey now takes us into the deepest, most speculative waters of our inquiry. We are entering the realm of fringe theories and anomalous artifacts, the whispers and curiosities that exist on the far edges of mainstream historical thought. These are the stories that pop up in late-night documentaries and online forums, tantalizing hints of a past even more complex than we can imagine. You are not in a specific time or place, but are sifting through a collection of strange, out-of-place objects. The first clue you pick up is a small, worn piece of metal. It's a Roman coin, a bronze tetradrachm, bearing the image of a long-dead emperor. Coins like this are found all over the Old World, from Britain to the Middle East, but this coin, and a handful of others like it, were reportedly found not in Europe or Africa, but in the Americas, plowed up in fields in states like Texas and Arkansas, or discovered in ancient burial mounds in the Ohio River Valley. How did they get here? Proponents of pre-Columbian contact theories see this as proof that Roman ships, perhaps blown thousands of miles off course, managed to cross the Atlantic nearly 2,000 years ago. You can picture it, a Roman merchant galley, laden with wine and olive oil, caught in a brutal storm off the Pillars of Hercules. For weeks, they are at the mercy of the wind and currents. Their masts splintered, their crew exhausted and terrified. They are pushed west, across an ocean they did not know existed, until they miraculously make landfall on an unknown shore. What happened to them? Did they attempt to build a new life? Did they trade their last few coins with the local inhabitants? It's a compelling, cinematic story. However, mainstream archaeologists are deeply skeptical. They argue that there has never been a single Roman artifact found in a controlled, professionally excavated archaeological context in the Americas. The coins, they suggest, were likely lost much more recently, dropped by modern collectors or brought over as souvenirs in the colonial era and later mixed into the soil. Next, you examine a series of colossal stone heads. You are in the humid lowlands of south-central Mexico, in the heartland of the ancient Olmec civilization, the first great civilization of Mesoamerica, carved from massive boulders of volcanic basalt. These heads are astonishing works of art. They stand up to 11 feet tall and weigh as much as 50 tons. Their features are powerful and distinct, with full lips, broad noses, and what appear to be tight-fitting helmets. They are believed to be portraits of mighty Olmec rulers, but some observers, particularly in the mid-20th century, saw something else in their features. They saw a resemblance to African faces. This gave rise to the theory of an ancient African presence in the Americas, led by figures like Ivan van Sertima, who argued in his book They Came Before Columbus that sailors from the Nubian civilization of ancient Egypt had crossed the Atlantic and influenced the development of Olmec culture. The evidence cited goes beyond the stone heads, including similarities in pyramid building, certain religious practices, and agricultural parallels. The theory suggests a profound and foundational connection between the Old and New worlds, long before Europe entered the picture. This is another area of intense academic debate. The vast majority of archaeologists and historians of Mesoamerica reject this theory. They argue that the features on the Olmec heads are well within the range of Native American physiognomy, and that the cultural similarities are either coincidental or based on superficial comparisons. They point to the complete lack of any confirmed African artifacts or DNA in ancient American contexts. The list of these speculative claims goes on. There are accounts of Japanese pottery found in Ecuador, alleged Hebrew inscriptions found in a burial mound in Tennessee, and even claims of ancient Egyptians reaching Australia. Each of these stories presents a tantalizing puzzle, a thread that, if pulled, could unravel the entire tapestry of established history. While most are dismissed by scholars as hoaxes, misinterpretations, or simply wishful thinking, they speak to a deep and fascinating part of the human psyche. They reveal our collective desire to find connections, to believe in a world that was more interconnected, more mysterious, and more full of epic, forgotten journeys than the official records suggest. You are sitting in a vast dark room, like a library at midnight. All around you, the stories we have just explored are swirling like loose pages in a gentle whirlwind. You see the determined faces of the hunters crossing the ice bridge. You see the glint of jade in a Mayan smile, the terror in the eyes of a Norseman facing a surprise attack, the calm confidence of a Polynesian navigator reading the stars. You hear the whisper of a Welsh legend and the chant of a saint's prayer on a leather boat. It's a beautiful, chaotic, and complicated mess. And then, through the swirl, one story pushes its way to the front. It's the simple, familiar tale of 3 small ships and 1 determined man. Why? Why does that one story, despite all we now know, still hold such a powerful grip on our collective imagination? The answer has less to do with history and more to do with the way your own mind works. Your brain is a magnificent machine, but it is also inherently lazy. It loves shortcuts. It craves patterns and simple, clear narratives. A story with thousands of anonymous protagonists migrating over 20,000 years is complex and difficult to visualize. A story about dozens of possible, unconfirmed landfalls is messy and unsatisfying. But a story about one man, with a clear goal, who overcomes great odds to achieve a singular, world-changing moment, that is a story your brain can grab onto. It is clean. It has a hero. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It transforms the messy, sprawling reality of history into a neat, digestible fable. This need for a simple origin story is also deeply tied to the creation of national identity. For the United States, a young nation composed of immigrants, the story of Columbus provided a powerful, non-British founding myth. It was a starting point. It's no coincidence that Columbus Day was first proclaimed a national holiday in 1892, amidst a massive wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and was heavily championed by the Knights of Columbus as a way to celebrate Italian-American heritage and assert Catholic belonging in a predominantly Protestant country. He became a symbol, an American Genesis story that had nothing to do with the Mayflower or the Revolutionary War. This tendency to search for a single, originating source is a quirk of human psychology that has a name in some academic circles. It's related to an eccentric concept known as hyperdiffusionism, the belief that most major inventions and cultural developments can be traced back to a single, ancient super-civilization, like the Egyptians or the inhabitants of a lost Atlantis. While this is an extreme and unsubstantiated view, it highlights our deep-seated desire for a simple, linear explanation for a complex world. Psychologists and historians still debate whether these simplifying myths are consciously engineered for political gain or if they emerge more organically, bubbling up from a collective psychological need for a story that makes us feel secure. So you sit in this dark library and you look at the one brightly lit figure of Columbus on the stage. He is easy to see, easy to understand. His story feels complete, but it's a spotlight that casts very long, very deep shadows. It obscures the millions of people who are already here, living in complex societies. It hides the Viking longships that landed 500 years earlier. It ignores the subtle but profound evidence of Polynesian contact. We focus on him because it is comfortable. It is emotionally satisfying. But what happens if we begin to adjust the lighting? What happens when we zoom out from the single actor and look at the whole, vast, crowded stage? To understand the true impact of his arrival, you have to first understand the world he was about to unknowingly collide with, and the world he was leaving behind. You are no longer in a library of thought, but in a physical place, a city humming with nervous energy. You are walking through the crowded, winding streets of Seville, Spain, in the late 15th century. The air is a thick soup of smells. You smell the sharp, clean scent of salt and tar from the nearby port, the heady mix of spices like cinnamon and clove wafting from a merchant's stall, and underneath it all, the less romantic odors of wood smoke, livestock, and open sewers. This is not the clean, silent world of ancient ruins or the pristine wilderness of a new continent. This is Europe, a continent that feels old, crowded, and hungry. It is a world on the brink of a profound and violent change. The source of this hunger, the engine driving the frantic energy of this city, is trade, specifically the trade in spices. To you, spices are a common commodity, something you buy in a small glass jar at the supermarket. But here, in 1490, they are the equivalent of oil, microchips, and designer drugs all rolled into one. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon are worth more than their weight in gold. They are not just for flavoring the bland European diet. They are preservatives, medicines, and the ultimate status symbol. A man who could afford to sprinkle pepper on his food was displaying wealth as ostentatiously as if he were eating gold leaf. An eccentric but telling fact of the era is that pepper was often sold by the single peppercorn and used to pay rent, taxes, and dowries. For centuries, this unimaginably lucrative trade was controlled by a complex network of middlemen. Spices were grown on tiny islands in Indonesia, transported by Arab sailors across the Indian Ocean, hauled by camel caravans across the deserts of the Middle East, and finally, purchased by Venetian and Genoese merchants who held a suffocating monopoly on their distribution to the rest of Europe. But in 1453, a world-shaking event occurred. The Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, effectively slamming a door on the major overland trade routes to the east. The flow of spices became a trickle, and the prices skyrocketed. A new way to Asia was no longer a dream for ambitious merchants. It was a strategic and economic necessity for the rising nations of Europe. The first to find a sea route around this blockade would become the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth. Now, you turn your attention to the political heart of Spain. This is a nation that has just been born, forged in the crucible of an almost 800-year-long war known as the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Moorish kingdoms. In January of 1492, the final chapter of that war concluded. Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, the joint monarchs of a newly unified Spain, watched as the flag of the Emirate of Granada was lowered for the last time. Spain was now a single, militantly Catholic kingdom, filled with national pride and a surplus of soldiers. Ambitious noblemen known as hidalgos, who had spent their entire lives fighting and now had no war to fight. This unique moment in history created the perfect conditions for a grand gamble. Spain was broke from the war, but it was also fiercely competitive with its neighbor, Portugal, which had been methodically exploring a route south around Africa for decades. Isabella, a monarch of profound and fervent religious conviction, saw her victory as a sign of God's favor. She was ready for the next great crusade. Historians still debate the primary motivations of the Spanish crown. Was it a calculated commercial venture driven by Ferdinand's pragmatism, or a divinely inspired mission to spread Christianity to the unconverted lands of the East, as Isabella saw it? It was likely a potent, and ultimately explosive, combination of all three. They had the motive, they had the manpower, and thanks to recent innovations like the maneuverable caravel ship and the astrolabe for navigation, they had just enough technology to make a mad dream seem plausible. All they needed was a man with a plan. Into this volatile and ambitious world of 15th century Spain steps a man. You see him now, not as the heroic statue, but as he likely was, a middle-aged man with prematurely white hair, piercing blue eyes, and the weathered face of a lifelong sailor. He is not Spanish, but an Italian from Genoa, named Cristoforo Colombo. He is intense, charismatic, and possessed of a single, all-consuming obsession. He is a man who is both brilliant and spectacularly, fundamentally wrong. For years, Columbus has been a man on the fringes, a persistent and often annoying presence in the royal courts of Europe. He has been to Portugal, to England, to France, and has been rejected by all of them. His plan is simple, audacious, and based on a series of colossal miscalculations. You are in a chamber in the Spanish court, watching him make his pitch to a council of royal advisors. He unrolls a map of the world. It is the world as understood by the most learned men of his day. A world based on the ancient geography of Ptolemy, but with Columbus's own optimistic modifications. His first, and most critical, error is the size of the earth. Educated people in the 15th century did not believe the world was flat. That is a myth invented much later. The ancient Greeks had calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, but Columbus chose to believe the much smaller and incorrect calculations of other geographers. He essentially shaved about 25% off the planet's waistline. His second error was to vastly overestimate the eastward landmass of Asia. He relied on the accounts of Marco Polo and others, stretching the Asian continent so far to the east that it wrapped a significant way around his smaller globe. The result of these two compounded errors was a dramatic underestimation of the ocean that lay to the west. He believed that Japan, or Chipangu as he called it, was only about 2,400 nautical miles from the Canary Islands. The actual distance is closer to 10,600 nautical miles. The Spanish scholars and maritime experts listened to his presentation. They are not fools. They know their Eratosthenes and their Ptolemy. They tell him, quite correctly, that his math is wrong. They tell him the ocean is far, far wider than he claims, and that no ship of their day could possibly carry enough food and water for such a voyage. They conclude that the project is vain and impossible. For years, they advise Ferdinand and Isabella to reject him. So why, after all this rejection, did they finally say yes? The timing was everything. Remember, the Reconquista had just ended. The treasury was empty, but the national spirit was soaring. The rival Portuguese were on the verge of rounding Africa. Spain needed a long shot, a cheap gamble that could have a massive payoff. The cost of outfitting Columbus's 3 small ships was significant, but not bankrupting, roughly equivalent to the cost of a single state banquet. One of the more obscure but fascinating elements of his proposal was his personal ambition. Columbus wasn't just asking for ships, he drove a hard bargain. He demanded that he be made admiral of the ocean sea and viceroy and governor of all the lands he claimed for Spain. He also demanded 10% of all the revenues from these new lands, in perpetuity, for himself and his descendants. These were astonishing, almost laughably audacious demands for a foreign commoner to make of powerful monarchs. It is a testament to his incredible self-belief, or perhaps his sheer desperation. Historians still debate whether Isabella and Ferdinand ever truly believed in his geographical theories, or if they simply saw him as a useful and ultimately expendable tool in their geopolitical chess match with Portugal. They likely figured that if he failed, they would lose a small investment. If, by some miracle, he succeeded, the rewards would be beyond measure. In April of 1492, they signed the contract, the capitulations of Santa Fe. The Grand Miscalculation was about to be launched. The royal contract is signed. The funds are secured. You are now in the small port town of Palos de la Frontera in southwestern Spain. It is August of 1492. The air is thick with anticipation and the low-grade hum of fear. This is not a glorious expedition filled with eager volunteers. Columbus is a foreigner with a strange accent and a mad idea. Most experienced sailors in Palos want nothing to do with this voyage into the Sea of Darkness. He has to scrape together a crew. Some are seasoned mariners, like the Pinzon brothers, who captained the Nina and the Pinta, and whose involvement lends the project some much-needed local credibility. Others are petty criminals, given a royal pardon in exchange for signing on. You are on the deck of the Santa Maria, the largest of the three ships, but still a creaking, tub-like vessel, barely the length of a modern tennis court. It is crowded, cramped, and it smells of unwashed bodies, livestock, and the ever-present stench of the bilge. On the morning of August 3rd, the fleet catches the tide and drifts out into the Atlantic. For the first month, the sailing is relatively easy. They make a stop at the Canary Islands for final repairs and provisions. And then, on September 6th, they catch the trade winds and sail due west. The coast of the last known island disappears over the eastern horizon. Now, there is nothing. Just an endless, empty circle of blue water and blue sky. Days turn into weeks. The mood on the ships begins to sour. This is the longest anyone on board has ever been out of sight of land. The men grow restless, muttering in corners. They are sailors, not philosophers, and the old fears of sea monsters and a world that simply drops off into nothingness begin to surface. They start to suspect that Columbus, this mad Genoese, has led them to their doom. Columbus is a brilliant navigator, a master of dead reckoning, but he is also a clever psychologist. He knows his men are close to the breaking point. To manage their fear, he keeps two separate logs. One, for his own records, contains the true distance they have traveled each day. The other, which he shows to the crew, deliberately fudges the numbers, making their progress seem slower, their distance from home less terrifying. By early October, the situation is desperate. The men are on the verge of open mutiny. They have been at sea for over a month, and there has been no sign of land. Then, small, hopeful clues begin to appear in the water. They see a carved stick, seemingly worked by human hands. They see a branch with fresh green leaves and flowers still on it. Most importantly, they see flocks of land birds flying purposefully southwest. Columbus, in a crucial command decision, alters his course to follow them. It is a decision that will change the world. On the night of October 11th, Columbus stands on the stern castle, staring intently into the darkness. He thinks he sees a light, a faint flicker, like a small candle rising and falling in the distance. A few hours later, around 2 in the morning on October 12th, a lookout on the Pinta, a man named Rodrigo de Triana, shouts the words everyone has been waiting to hear for 36 agonizing days. Tierran, land, land. You are there on the deck as the dawn breaks. It is a moment of almost unbearable emotional release. Relief, triumph, and profound wonder wash over the exhausted crew. Before you, shrouded in the morning mist, is a low, green island fringed with white sandy beaches. It is not the bustling ports of Japan or the golden-roofed palaces of China that Columbus had promised. It is a quiet, verdant, and already inhabited world. As the ships drop anchor and the first boats are lowered into the impossibly clear water, no one on board can possibly comprehend the full meaning of what they have just done. They believe they have found a new route to an old world. In reality, they have just lit the fuse on a collision of two worlds, a collision that will reshape the planet forever. You step ashore with Columbus and his men. The people who greet you are of the Taino tribe. They are, as Columbus notes in his own journal, remarkably gentle and generous. They are fascinated by the beards, the heavy clothes, and especially the metal swords of the newcomers. They have never seen forged metal before. In a moment of chilling innocence, they reach out and grasp the blades, cutting themselves, having no concept of a sharpened edge. This moment, this first fumbling interaction on a Bahamian beach, is not the end of a voyage. It is the beginning of something else entirely. It is the starting pistol for the single greatest biological and cultural event in the history of life on Earth. It is the Columbian Exchange. For tens of thousands of years, the eastern and western hemispheres had been two separate worlds, two gigantic, isolated laboratories of evolution. Now, the wall between them has been breached. It is not just an exchange of people and ideas, but of plants, animals, and microbes. You watch as the process begins. From the old world, the Europeans bring things that will fundamentally remake the Americas. They bring wheat, barley, and rice. They bring sugarcane, which will create a brutal new economy of plantations and slavery. They bring domesticated animals that the Americas have never seen. Horses, which will revolutionize the lives of the Plains Indians, turning them into the greatest light cavalry the world has ever known. They bring cattle, sheep, and goats, and they bring pigs, which will become an ecological wrecking ball, devouring native plants and spreading disease. But the most devastating conquistadors of all are invisible, stowaways in the breath and blood of the Europeans. They are the old world diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, the bubonic plague. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, having been isolated for millennia, have no built-up immunity to these pathogens. The diseases sweep through the continent like a biological firestorm, an invisible army that kills on a scale that is nearly impossible to comprehend. In many places, 90% of the population dies. Entire civilizations are hollowed out, reduced to ghost towns, before a European soldier even sets foot in them. It is one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. The exchange, however, is not a one-way street. The Americas will also transform the old world. You see the ships returning to Europe, their holds filled with wonders. They bring back maize, or corn, which will become a staple food for both humans and livestock across Europe and Africa. They bring the humble potato, an unassuming tuber that will end the cycle of famine in Northern Europe and fuel a population boom. They bring back tomatoes, which will, after a period of being viewed with suspicion as a poison, completely revolutionize the cuisine of Italy and the Mediterranean. Imagine Italian food without tomato sauce. That was the world before 1492. They also bring back chili peppers, peanuts, vanilla, and cacao, the source of chocolate. And they bring back tobacco, a plant that will create a new global addiction and a vast new source of wealth. In the midst of this exchange of life, there is one dark and persistent mystery. The exchange of diseases was not entirely one-sided. A new and terrible disease appears in Europe in 1495, just after Columbus's crew's return. It spreads with terrifying speed, first appearing among soldiers in Naples. It becomes known as the Great Pox. Today, we call it syphilis. Historians and epidemiologists still debate the true origin of syphilis, questioning whether it was a New World disease carried back by the sailors or simply a pre-existing Old World disease that mutated into a more virulent form at that exact moment. But the timing is undeniably suspicious. This potential microbial revenge is a stark and intimate reminder that when these two worlds collided, the consequences, both good and bad, flowed in both directions, fusing two halves of the planet into one single, chaotic, and irrevocably connected world. The vast world-altering consequences of the Columbian exchange are now in motion, a process that will continue for centuries. But in the immediate aftermath, our story comes back to the man at its center. Columbus returns to Spain not as the discoverer of a new continent, a concept that no one, including himself, yet understands, but as a hero who has successfully found a westward route to the outskirts of Asia. He brings back a small amount of gold, colorful parrots, some strange plants, and several captive Taino people to display at court. He is at the height of his fame and power, named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, as promised. He will make 3 more voyages, continuing to explore the Caribbean, convinced until the day he dies that he is in the East Indies, referring to the native people as Indians, a misnomer that will stick for 500 years. His subsequent voyages, however, are not triumphs. They are marked by failure and brutality. As governor of the new colony of Hispaniola, he proves to be a disastrous administrator. He and his brothers preside over a regime of forced labor and violence against the Taino people, enslaving them to mine for gold. His mismanagement is so severe that the Spanish crown eventually has him arrested and brought back to Spain in chains. He is stripped of his governorship, though he retains his titles. His reputation is tarnished, and he dies in 1506, a wealthy but embittered man, feeling that he has been cheated of the glory and power he was owed. For centuries after his death, he is a relatively minor historical figure. So how did this flawed and ultimately disappointed man become the heroic, almost mythical, discoverer of America? The process was slow, and it was driven by the needs of a new nation. Fast forward nearly 300 years, you are in the newly formed United States of America. The young country is trying to forge its own identity, separate from its former colonial master, Great Britain. It needs its own heroes, its own founding myths. Columbus, a Genoese sailor in the service of Spain, is the perfect candidate. He is a non-British, almost classical figure who can be adopted as a secular patron saint. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, his name is suddenly everywhere. The capital district is named Columbia. Universities, like Columbia and King's College, are renamed in his honor. Poems and biographies are written, recasting him as a visionary genius, a man of science and reason who battled against the ignorance and superstition of medieval Europe. The most influential of these was a hugely popular biography written in 1828 by the author Washington Irving, the same man who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Irving's book was a masterpiece of historical fiction, a romanticized and largely fabricated account that cemented the popular image of Columbus for generations. It was Irving who popularized the myth that Columbus was a lone genius trying to convince a world of flat earthers. This image of Columbus as a solitary, enlightened hero who embodies the American spirit of individualism and discovery becomes the standard version of the story, taught in every schoolhouse across the country. The final step in his canonization comes with the 400th anniversary of his voyage in 1892. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago is a massive, spectacular World's Fair celebrating his achievement and, by extension, for centuries of American progress. It is at this moment, reinforced by the lobbying efforts of groups like the Knights of Columbus, that his discovery is enshrined not just as a historical event, but as a foundational moment in the American civil religion. Historians still debate the complex process of myth-making, but it's clear that the heroic image of Columbus was constructed over centuries, piece by piece, to serve a specific cultural and political purpose. It was a story that a young, forward-looking nation wanted and needed to tell about itself. It was a story that was simple, heroic, and, as we have seen, profoundly incomplete. You are standing now at the end of this long, winding journey through time. The heroic statue of Columbus, once so solid and simple, has dissolved. In its place is a swirling collage of images, You see the determined eyes of a hunter wrapped in fur, peering into the vast, untouched landscape of a new continent. You see the splintered wood of a Viking longhouse on a Newfoundland shore, a testament to a forgotten saga. You see the glint of the sun on a Polynesian paddle, dipping into the Pacific on its way to a strange new coast. Each of these is a story of a first arrival, a moment of profound discovery. The word itself, discovery, begins to feel heavy, inadequate. It implies a single event, a moment when a light is switched on in a dark room. But the history of the Americas is not a dark room. It was a world already filled with light, with millions of people, thousands of cultures, and a history stretching back 20,000 years. So perhaps the question is not who discovered America. Perhaps the better question is, whose arrival mattered the most? And if that is the question, the answer becomes clearer and more troubling. The arrival of Columbus, a man who didn't even know where he was, mattered most not because he was first, but because his arrival was permanent. He was the first in a wave that became a flood, the catalyst for an irreversible connection between two worlds that had been separate since the dawn of humanity. It's a fascinating historical fact that the continents are not named for him. They are named for another Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, who sailed a few years after Columbus and was perhaps the first to truly grasp that this was not Asia, but a mundus novus, a new world. This realization was famously immortalized on the Waldseemüller map of Wuling Sea, the first map in history to label the new landmass with the name America. In a curious historical footnote, the mapmaker, Martin Waldseemüller, later had second thoughts and removed the name from his subsequent maps, but the idea was too powerful. The name had already stuck. Historians still debate the extent to which Amerigo Vespucci's own accounts of his voyages were embellished or even fabricated to enhance his own reputation and geographical